On June 22, 1941, Germany made a political decision disguised as a military strategy. The invasion of the Soviet Union was not forced by circumstance or enemy action. It was a choice rooted in ideology, launched before the war in the West was won, and executed despite every strategic principle that had brought Germany success. Within 6 months, that decision had destroyed Germany's ability to respond to any crisis it had not anticipated. The Wehrmacht would never again possess strategic flexibility. And without flexibility, defeat became not a possibility but a timeline. Germany's strategic position in June 1941 appeared strong on the surface but was fundamentally fragile. Britain remained undefeated and unoccupied. The Battle of the Atlantic was far from won. German forces occupied vast territories from Norway to Greece, requiring hundreds of thousands of troops for garrison duty. The Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority over England. German industry was not yet on full war footing. Every strategic indicator suggested consolidation, not expansion. Yet Hitler and the Nazi leadership chose to open a second front against an enemy with nearly unlimited manpower and industrial depth. The decision to invade the Soviet Union was not a response to Soviet aggression or an unavoidable strategic necessity. It was the fulfillment of ideological goals that had defined Nazi policy from the beginning. Hitler had written about destroying the Soviet Union and seizing living space in the East years before taking power. The Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939 was always temporary in his mind, a tactical maneuver to avoid a two-front war while dealing with France and Britain. By mid-1941, with France defeated and Britain isolated, Hitler believed the moment had arrived to achieve his primary objective. Ideology was driving strategy, and strategy was being subordinated to political vision. The military leadership raised concerns but ultimately complied. Some generals questioned the timing, arguing that Britain should be defeated or neutralized first. Others worried about the vast distances involved and the proven resilience of Russian armies in previous conflicts. A few understood that invading the Soviet Union while still at war with Britain violated the fundamental lesson Germany should have learned from World War I: never fight a multi-front war of attrition. But these concerns were either dismissed or simply ignored. Hitler's confidence was absolute. He predicted the Soviet Union would collapse within 8 to 10 weeks. He claimed that one swift campaign would eliminate the threat in the East, freeing Germany to finish off Britain and dominate Europe. This confidence rested on profound miscalculations about Soviet military capability, industrial capacity, and political cohesion. German intelligence drastically underestimated the number of Soviet divisions, the quality of Soviet equipment, and the Soviet Union's ability to mobilize reserves. The assumption that the Soviet state would fracture under initial defeats ignored the nature of Stalin's regime and the determination of Soviet citizens when facing existential invasion. German planning assumed that destroying the Red Army in border battles would end Soviet resistance. This was fantasy presented as analysis, and it became the foundation for Germany's largest military operation. Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, with over 3 million German and Axis troops crossing the Soviet border. The initial attacks achieved tactical surprise and inflicted massive casualties. Soviet forces in forward positions were encircled and destroyed. German armored spearheads advanced hundreds of kilometers in the first weeks. Every short-term indicator suggested Hitler's predictions were correct. But beneath the surface, the fundamental miscalculation was already becoming apparent. the Soviets did not collapse. They retreated, regrouped, and continued fighting. New armies appeared behind those that had been destroyed. And the vast distances of Russia began consuming German logistics and mobility. By August 1941, the campaign that was supposed to end in 10 weeks showed no signs of concluding. German forces had advanced deep into Soviet territory but had not achieved decisive victory. Soviet resistance was stiffening rather than crumbling. German casualties were mounting faster than replacements could arrive. Equipment losses, particularly in tanks and vehicles, were unsustainable. Most critically, the Wehrmacht was now fully committed to an open-ended campaign in the East while still maintaining forces in the West, North Africa, and the Balkans. Germany had voluntarily placed itself in exactly the strategic position it needed to avoid simultaneous wars of attrition on multiple fronts. The political decision to invade had destroyed Germany's strategic flexibility in ways that became more apparent with each passing month. Before Barbarossa, Germany could shift forces between theaters based on opportunity and threat. After Barbarossa, the Eastern Front consumed everything. Divisions could not be withdrawn without risking collapse. Reserves were fed into the meat grinder of continuous combat. Air assets that might have challenged British bombers or secured the Mediterranean were locked into supporting ground operations in Russia. Germany had transformed itself from a strategically agile power into a nation with a single, all-consuming commitment from which it could not disengage. The failure to achieve quick victory created cascading strategic vulnerabilities. In December 1941, the Soviet counteroffensive at Moscow shattered the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility and guaranteed that the Eastern Front would last through another year at minimum. That same month, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States into the war. Hitler then compounded the strategic disaster by declaring war on America, a decision that made no military sense but followed from the ideological worldview that had driven the Soviet invasion. Germany was now at war with the three largest industrial powers on Earth simultaneously, and its armies were frozen in the Russian winter hundreds of miles from their supply bases. Through 1942 and 1943, the consequences of the original political decision metastasized. Germany could not reinforce North Africa adequately because divisions were needed in Russia. It could not build Atlantic wall defenses to full strength because manpower was consumed in the East. It could not redirect industrial production toward defensive systems or advanced weapons because current needs on the Eastern Front demanded maximum output of conventional equipment. Every strategic option involved choosing which crisis to underfund. The flexibility to respond to new threats or exploit new opportunities had been sacrificed to maintain the commitment in the Soviet Union. The Eastern Front became a resource black hole from which nothing could be recovered without triggering collapse. By 1943, Germany was losing the equivalent of an entire army group annually on the Eastern Front. These were not just casualties but permanent losses of trained soldiers, experienced officers, and irreplaceable equipment. The Wehrmacht was being bled white in a campaign that had lost any prospect of decisive victory but could not be abandoned without immediate catastrophic defeat. Germany was trapped in strategic paralysis, continuing an unwinnable campaign because the cost of stopping was immediate disaster while the cost of continuing was eventual certain defeat. The political decision had also created diplomatic isolation from which Germany could not escape. The invasion of the Soviet Union eliminated any possibility of a separate peace with Britain or the United States. Western Allied leaders might have disagreed on many issues, but opposition to Nazi Germany became the foundation of their alliance. As long as Germany was attempting to conquer the Soviet Union and implement its racial ideology across Eastern Europe, no negotiated settlement was possible. Hitler's political choice had unified his enemies in a way no military campaign could have achieved. Germany was locked into a fight to the finish with no path to diplomatic resolution. The impact on German grand strategy was total and irreversible. Before June 1941, Germany could have pursued multiple strategic options, consolidating gains in Europe, focusing on the Mediterranean, negotiating with Britain, preparing for a potential conflict with America. After June 1941, Germany had only one strategy: survive on the Eastern Front while trying to hold everywhere else. This was not a strategy for victory but a timetable for defeat. The only question was how long Germany could sustain the unsustainable before systemic collapse. By 1944, the consequences had become undeniable and terminal. When the Western Allies landed in Normandy, Germany lacked the mobile reserves to throw them back into the sea because those reserves had been destroyed in Russia. When the Red Army launched Operation Bagration, Germany could not shift forces from the west to stabilize the east because defending France required every available division. The Wehrmacht was fighting two massive campaigns simultaneously with resources sufficient for neither. This was the final consequence of the political decision made in June 1941. Germany had destroyed its own strategic flexibility and was now being crushed from both directions with no ability to prioritize or respond. The human cost of this political choice was staggering and avoidable. Millions of German soldiers died fighting a war their leadership had chosen to start before finishing the war they were already fighting. Soviet losses were even more catastrophic, including millions of civilians murdered in the occupied territories. The Eastern Front became the bloodiest theater in human history, not because of military necessity but because of a political decision to launch an ideological war of annihilation. Every death after the initial invasion stemmed from Germany's choice to destroy its strategic position for the sake of Nazi racial ideology. German military professionals understood the scale of the disaster even as it unfolded. General Heinz Guderian, among others, recognized that invading the Soviet Union before defeating Britain was strategic insanity. But the Nazi system did not allow military logic to override political ideology. Hitler was not just the head of state but the embodiment of the political movement that defined Germany's purpose. Opposing the invasion meant opposing the core goal of Nazi policy. The military leadership could advise and object, but they could not prevent a decision that was fundamentally political rather than strategic. The contrast with Germany's enemies was instructive and damning. The Soviet Union, despite Stalin's catastrophic failures in 1941, maintained enough strategic flexibility to relocate entire industries eastward and build new armies. Britain, while under existential threat, never committed to campaigns that destroyed its ability to respond to new challenges. The United States entered the war with a strategy of defeating Germany first precisely because it understood the danger of being locked into unwinnable commitments. Each of Germany's major enemies retained the ability to shift resources, change priorities, and adapt to circumstances. Germany had voluntarily surrendered that ability in pursuit of ideological goals. The decision to invade the Soviet Union also revealed the fundamental flaw in Nazi strategic thinking, the belief that willpower and ideological commitment could overcome material and strategic reality. Hitler genuinely believed that racial superiority meant German soldiers would defeat numerically larger Soviet forces through sheer quality. He thought that the Soviet Union's communist system would collapse under military pressure. He assumed that ideological correctness guaranteed victory. This was magical thinking applied to industrial warfare. And when reality refused to conform to ideology, the response was not to adjust strategy but to blame individuals for insufficient commitment. By 1945, Germany was fighting in the ruins of its own territory with enemies advancing from all directions. This was not the result of overwhelming enemy strength alone. It was the inevitable consequence of a political decision made 4 years earlier that had destroyed Germany's strategic flexibility and locked it into a war it could not win. The invasion of the Soviet Union had been presented as Germany's path to final victory. Instead, it became the decision that made defeat mathematically certain and strategically irreversible. The broader lesson transcends the specific historical moment. Strategic flexibility is not a luxury but a necessity for any nation facing multiple potential threats. The ability to shift resources, change priorities, and respond to unexpected developments determines survival when facing powerful opponents. Germany's leadership sacrificed that flexibility for ideological objectives, and in doing so guaranteed their nation's defeat. They chose a politically motivated war over strategic coherence. They prioritized ideology over adaptability. And they discovered too late that inflexibility in strategy is indistinguishable from paralysis in execution. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that the decision was not forced on Germany by circumstances. No enemy action required the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. No immediate threat demanded opening a second front. Germany chose this path freely, driven by political ideology rather than strategic necessity. That choice revealed the fatal flaw at the heart of Nazi Germany, a political system where ideology overrode analysis, where belief replaced calculation, and where the leadership's vision of what should be true mattered more than what actually was true. In warfare, reality always wins. And reality's victory over Germany began the moment German forces crossed into Soviet territory. The final judgment is clear and unforgiving. The political choice to invade the Soviet Union was Germany's decisive strategic error, the decision that made all subsequent defeats inevitable. It destroyed Germany's flexibility, unified its enemies, and locked the Wehrmacht into an unwinnable campaign that consumed the military's strength without achieving its objectives. Every German defeat from 1943 onward can be traced directly to the consequences of this single political decision. Germany did not lose because its enemies were too strong. Germany lost because its leadership made a political choice that was strategically catastrophic. They invaded the Soviet Union not because they had to, but because Nazi ideology demanded it. And in doing so, they destroyed their own ability to win the war they had started. That decision sealed Germany's fate more surely than any battle or campaign. It was the moment when political fanaticism replaced strategic reason. And it guaranteed that Germany would not merely be defeated, but would be defeated without any strategic option to avoid or delay the inevitable collapse.